Hello and welcome to Curated Conversations, brought to you by the Museum Studies and Cultural Heritage Management Programs and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features Dr. Elizabeth Chu and her insights and experiences working with the staff and descendant community at James Madison's Montpelier. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Curated Conversations playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn the event over to Sean Blinn, alumnus for the Master of Arts in Museum Studies program. Sean.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you most of all to Dr. Elizabeth Chu, who is the interim CEO and president of James Madison's Montpelier. This is the latest of the Johns Hopkins MA program in Museum Studies series of webinars with museum leaders, and the first one that we've been able to open up beyond the Johns Hopkins community. So for all of our first-time attendees, welcome. The question of who gets to tell the story of the founding of the United States and whose stories matter has been playing out in the public sphere for a long time, more so in recent years, and will no doubt be even more in the public eye as the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence nears in 2026. The history of enslavement and how to interpret it in museums and historic sites is one of the most important aspects of telling accurate and inclusive histories. Last summer, the topic flared into public view at James Madison's Montpelier, which had established a solid record of working with the descendants of the enslaved African Americans who worked at the site. And we're delighted to be able to hear from Dr. Chu today about her role in that process. We'll first hear from her, and then, as Peter said, we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. I'd like to ask everybody, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. We may not see anything that gets posted only in chat. So with that, thank you all for attending, and welcome to Dr. Elizabeth Chu.
Thank you very much, Sean. And it's a great honor to be here, to be speaking with you today and sharing some of the experiences that my colleagues and I have had over the last, well, really way more than 20 years, way before I was ever working here. Could I have the first slide, please? So I'm going to be talking about a site in Orange County, Virginia, a presidential plantation site that is owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, run in co-stewardship with them by the Montpelier Foundation. And it is the site where 3 generations of President James Madison's family grew tobacco with the labor of people they held in slavery, and through which they gained their positions of affluence, status, and power in colonial and early federal America. Next slide, please. We're located in Orange County, Virginia, in the Virginia Piedmont. So that's the county that is orange, as you can see. We're about 90 miles southwest of Washington, D.C. And if you haven't ever visited, please feel free to come on by. Next slide, please. So, as I said, it was the lifelong home of James Madison, father of the U.S. Constitution, author of the Bill of Rights, and 4th president, and his wife, Dolly Payne Todd Madison, who's often very well known as having created the role of First Lady as we still think of it today. I think of them as the first American power couple. And they were people who, for either their entire lives or the great majority of their lives, benefited from the labor of people that they held in bondage. Next slide, please. Montpelier is a really interesting site because of its long history after the Madisons sold it in 1844. So we obviously can interpret the Madisons, the plantation under the Madisons, and the institution of slavery. Next, please. Next, please. But because of the, oh, sorry, go back. Yeah, there you go. Because of the continuing life of the site, we also have a remarkable survival of this is the picture in the lower left-hand corner of a freedman's home and farm. It's located on part of our property today that we've restored and interpret. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, there is also a Jim Crow era train station that was built by the 20th century owner of Montpelier, William DuPont. So we can interpret enslavement, emancipation, and reconstruction, and also Jim Crow in one site, which is, I think, unique in the country as far as I know. Next, please. Montpelier staff members have been engaged with descendants since the early 1990s. I'm going to sort of talk about the story of that, but this is just an example of some of the gatherings over the years. Next slide, please. And I'm also going to talk first about the whole concept of descendant community engagement. And this coalesced, the beginning of it coalesced around a project that some of you may remember or have read about, which happened in Lower Manhattan in the early 1990s, when a project to build a federal office building was halted because of the discovery of a very large burial ground of enslaved Africans from the very earliest years of settlement of colonial English settlement in Manhattan. And an anthropologist who worked on the project, Dr. Michael Blakey, was the scientific advisor to the project from 91 to 94. He was then a professor at Howard University, and he's now at William and Mary. He is the one who took a situation that was going downhill very fast in terms of community communication and advising and engagement, and turned it around to, and in the process of getting a consultation from the community, he coined the term descendant community. And because the world is a crazy place, Michael Blakey himself is a member of Montpelier's descendant community. So he's also been involved in everything here over the years. Next slide, please. The very first member of the descendant community to come to Montpelier in 1992 was Dr. Betty Kearse. And her family has a very strong oral history of descent from James Madison himself. And she first visited in 1992, met with Montpelier staff and archaeologists, local community members, local historians, and she's been coming back ever since. And in April of 2020, she published her book, The Other Madisons, The Lost History of a President's Black Family, that I would strongly recommend. She was a member of the Montpelier Descendant Committee organization, and she is also currently a member of the board of the Montpelier Foundation. Next slide, please. In the later 1990s, Montpelier archaeologists announced publicly that they had identified the location of the cemetery where the enslaved are interred at Montpelier. And that led community members, Carolyn French and Rebecca Gilmore Coleman, to approach Montpelier and ask if they could organize an event to commemorate the cemetery and celebrate the ancestors. And so this happened in the later 1990s. Carolyn French is the mother of the current chair of the Montpelier board, James French, and Rebecca Coleman has been closely involved at Montpelier and still is to this day. So this activity in the community led to the founding of the Orange County African American Historical Society, which was the first entity that the Montpelier staff collaborated with, and is still very much of a strong organization in Orange County, Virginia today. Next slide, please. So the first project that involved descendant community collaboration was the actual work to restore the Freedman's home that I mentioned just a couple of slides ago. And actually this was it was the farm that a formerly enslaved couple, George and Polly Gilmore, established across the road from the current Montpelier property. Went after emancipation, they were able to acquire the property and start living there in the early 1870s. And they are the great-great-grandparents of Rebecca Gilmore Coleman, who is our community partner to this day. So you see how the structure looked in 2000 on the far left, in the center during restoration, on the right how it looks today. Next slide, please. And the Gilmore family was involved along the way in archaeological study, in sharing oral history and research and knowledge to inform the interpretation of the site. Next slide, please. And this led to more of the community organizing itself, basically, and working with Montpelier staff to host a gathering in 2007. Next slide, please. And with input to Montpelier staff, because there was, at this point, absolutely no evidence of the institution of slavery around on the landscape around the main house, to construct these timber frame outlines of the slave dwellings and work buildings that we knew were located directly to the south of the main house and would have been extremely a part of any vista or understanding of the landscape of the Madison's time period, of President Madison's time period in particular. Next slide, please. So that project that I just showed, the timber frames, was obviously part of Descendants advisement and request. The next project was the actual work to restore and interpret the Jim Crow era train station. And in this project, we worked with members of the Montpelier Descendant Community, Madeline Anglin and Iris Ford, two first cousins whose grandfather worked for wages for the DuPonts, but whose forebears were certainly enslaved at Montpelier. And they shared their recollections of being teenagers in Jim Crow era Orange County, Virginia. In this structure, there were segregated waiting rooms, but there was also a US post office that was not segregated because federal facilities couldn't be in 1910 when the building was built. The contrast for visitors today is between the white waiting room and the waiting room that's marked colored. Next, please. So their descendants gathered over the years, several different times between 2007. This is in 2014, when descendants gathered in the fall to talk about what to do next, since the timber frames were what represented slavery on the landscape at that point. And in 2014, the descendants asked that Montpelier restore, that excavate, research, understand, and restore the actual buildings that had been there. And it's really important for me to say at this time, to this point, the connection, the relationship, the collaboration between descendants and the Montpelier staff had existed out at the staff level only. There was no formal relationship with the executive leadership or the board. It was simply kind of a working relationship between staff and descendants. And the staff would make decisions in a project about who to reach out to and call and ask, for help. And so from the beginning, it was an extractive relationship where the staff was taking oral history information, family stories, family collection items, and taking them from the descendants to use in our interpretation. But there was no formal relationship of any kind, and we didn't really until the mid 20-teens start compensating descendants for their collaboration and work with us. That's a really important step along the way to highlight. Next, please. So at the end of 2014, Montpelier was extremely fortunate to receive a $10 million gift from the self-described patriotic philanthropist David Rubenstein. And that's him in the upper left corner with our former president, Kat Imhoff. So the $10 million was to be for completing the furnishing of the main Madison house, for the archaeology to understand and reconstruct the buildings beside the house, the slave dwellings and work buildings, and to create an exhibition that would go on to be entitled The Mere Distinction of Color. And I'll talk about that process next. Next, please. So one thing that I haven't said is that the archaeology department here is very unique. It's been run by Dr. Matt Reeves since 2000. And it's a program where members of the public are welcome to come to site several times a year. They pay to stay, they stay on site, and they work side by side with a team of professional archaeologists. And in the project to understand the structures next to the house in the area we call the South Yard, descendants were involved in the archaeology process. They did not pay. They did not pay to come and dig where their people had been enslaved, but their participation was really important. Next slide, please. The next slide. So as you see, we excavated. Next slide. We excavated and reconstructed. Next slide. We excavated a total of 6 structures and rebuilt them. It was 3 dwellings, 2 smokehouses, and a kitchen. And every step of the way, or every time we started a building, members of the descendant community were involved. And many people spoke of the significance of locating an artifact in the ground and realizing that the last person to have touched it was an ancestor. And this very powerful connection that they could experience with that. Next slide, please. And of course, the involvement of the descendant community made everything better and richer and more complete. So you see the image of the tree on the left hand of the screen. So this is a very large oak tree. Oh, sorry, not an oak tree at all, a walnut tree. Whose roots were actually in the foundation of this structure that was built in the mid 18th century as a spinning house, and by the 1820s and 30s was being used as a dwelling. The descendants said, well, this is a witness tree. This tree, was here with our ancestors. We want you to do everything you can to save this tree, because the archaeological process would have likely killed it. But so our archaeologists and horticulturalists work together very closely to save the tree, and it is very much alive and well today. Another example of the extreme importance, the critical importance of involvement with the descendant community. The archaeologists found in the South Yard this clay pipe bowl fragment that has a Masonic emblem on it. So of course, with the mostly white, if not all white archaeologists jumped to the conclusion that this must have been something that a white person, lost or dropped, or in the South Yard, or had given to an enslaved person. But the descendant community members very quickly taught us that, in fact, the Masons and Masonic culture went very far back in African American history in the colonies in the early national period. And that it was very important, that's something that was very significant to African American culture. They also discovered the archaeologists discovered a crystal embedded in the corner pillar of one of the structures. And again, with the input of descendants, understood that this was something that was also very important in some African-American households, to have crystals that were in corners of foundation. So these are three members of the community putting a crystal in the corner of one of the structures as we're beginning to rebuild it in the summer of 2015. And then this is just to say that that Joe McGill and his slave dwelling project have had a number of overnight sleepovers at Montpelier in the South Yard, but also across the road at the Gilmore Cabin. Next slide, please. So staff members also invited or didn't collaborated. That's a very bad word to use. Collaborated with descendants. Here we have Matt Reeves and I, along with Hugh Alexander and Elise Vaughn, giving a presentation at the Slave Dwelling Project Conference in Columbia, South Carolina, I think in about 2016. So, you know, we presented the research together as well. Next slide, please. And then as we were gearing up to do the big project, the big exhibition project for the, with the David Rubenstein funding, we had, again, the staff members are the ones asking descendants to come. There was no kind of parallel structure at that point. We had a big advisory committee meeting for the exhibition, The Mere Distinction of Color, beginning in October of 2015 and going for the next 2 years until the project was completed in June of 2017. Next slide. So the idea was to do an exhibition about slavery that would be sort of generally contextual about the institution of slavery, but also talk about the individual experience of living in slavery at Montpelier during President Madison's lifetime. So the two big sort of North Stars, if you will, the two things that we were very much aware of the whole time were the request to emphasize the humanity of the ancestors and not to leave slavery in the past. Those were very much with us the whole time. Next slide, please. So we worked with a design firm called Crown and a media firm called Northern Light Productions, both based in Boston, on the exhibition. This is just an example of the text panels and the images. Next slide, please. We were very intentional on including the names of everyone that we know that lived in slavery at Montpelier. We have about 300 names, but we don't have all of them by any means. Next slide, please. We used photography from the Library of Congress of people who had lived in slavery in the before the war, but whose identities had not been captured for probably obvious reasons. And of course, a lot of times sites that interpret periods of time before the invention of photography in 1839, which we do, or think they shouldn't use photographs. But we thought that these photographs were so important, and it was really important to suggest human presence in the space. So we went ahead and used photographs. We made it clear that they are not photographs of people known to have been enslaved here at Montpelier. Next slide, please. And we also used shadow imagery in the exhibition to suggest human presence and to suggest the universality of human experience that crosses all boundaries and races and everything. Next slide, please. Just some more pictures of people in the exhibition. Next slide, please. And we also used the voices, the faces, and the stories of members of the descendant community to tell the stories of their ancestors, to talk about their own experiences of learning about their enslaved ancestors, and also to share information about the institution of slavery so that in large part, the voice of the exhibition is the voice of the descendant community. Next slide, please. And we had a local photographer, Eduardo Montes Bradley, took these beautiful photographs that we used in the exhibition. Next slide, please. We made 2 films. So in emphasizing the humanity of the ancestors, we really wanted the exhibition to appeal to people's empathy and sense of humanity. I think often at historic sites, at least before the last few years, slavery tended to be taught as a kind of an academic subject and removed from the experiences of individual human beings. So we can kind of put it away so it's not so hard to deal with. But we wanted to do the opposite of that. So this video told the story of Dolly Madison, after President Madison's death, selling off members of the family of her enslaved lady's maid who had served her for 30 plus years, and then selling off Susan Stewart, or Suki, the enslaved lady's maid. And so obviously, it's very hard for many of us to in any way comprehend what the experience of being enslaved would be. But we can think about what it would be like if you just one day suddenly lost your family member or loved one, knew that they were alive, but somewhere that you didn't know, or maybe they were not alive, and just the kind of human empathy that would engender. So that's what this one video is about. Next slide, please. And then another video is about the legacies of slavery that are with us today. I think it's kind of a tendency at historic sites to, there are sites doing quite a good job now with interpreting the institution of slavery, but we kind of, check that box off and leave it. And then maybe we'll pick up, next with the civil rights movement. But of course, this very long period of the failure of Reconstruction, and then Jim Crow, and then everything that led up to the civil rights movement. We don't, as Americans, do a very good job of understanding and dealing with that and accepting that, and seeing that as a reality. So this very short film really tried to help people get their heads around what are these legacies? What do we still live with in terms of economic, health outcomes, mass incarceration, educational inequality, and just the way that it still permeates our society today. Next slide, please. So this is, next slide, please. The exhibition is also out in the South Yard, in the space, the buildings that we reconstructed. Some of them are furnished as dwelling spaces, and we use both written sources where we have them and archaeological sources to do the furnishing and the furnishing plans and the furnishing. Next slide, please. But we also didn't want to lose the sense of human beings that we had worked on in the rest of the exhibition. So we, in several of the space, I think actually in all the spaces, we have these panels where descendants, with their image, their pictures and their own words, because you push a button and you listen to a sound file, talking about either an enslaved person or an enslaved couple who lived at Montpelier, talking about their own family story, sharing how their own family oral history informed what we did at Montpelier, a variety of different ways that we use these recordings. Next slide, please. So the exhibition opened to the public on June the 4th, 2017. And that was, just a couple of months prior to the events that happened in Charlottesville later that summer with the Unite the Right rally. We are about 20 miles from Charlottesville. Many of us live in Charlottesville. I do, for example. And so that day was obviously a milestone, or sort of a marker day. We all remember where we were in that terrible day. And people often assume that the exhibition was a response to that, but in fact, it opened 2 months prior. But one thing that was an outcome of the exhibition and of the experiences that we had was this gathering in February of 2018 of the National Summit on Teaching Slavery, where we invited descendants from sites of enslavement all over the East, museum professionals and academics to come together and to talk about this descendant engagement practices and how we could create a rubric of best practices. And that rubric document is what you see on the right. Next, please. So we had this incredibly brilliant facilitator, Dina Bailey. Next slide, please. We worked in small breakout groups. Next slide, please. There were young people, there were more senior people. Next slide, please. And what we sort of crystallized around was 3 pillars, as we call them: historical research, relationship building, and interpretation. That we sort of thought of as the 3 areas on which institutions should grade themselves, if you will. So those were the 3 working groups. Next slide, please. And so we got sort of an outline for the rubric over that long weekend, and then a smaller writing committee worked from February until the end of the summer to actually draft the document. And it had an afterword written by Dr. Michael Blakey, who I talked about earlier, coined the term descendant engagement, and is a member of the community at Montpelier. And then ASLH published it in their history news as a technical leaflet. I think it was that fall. It might have been a year later. I'm sorry to not be so, sorry to be a little bit vague on that, but it was published in history news. Next slide, please. And a couple of colleagues of mine did some conference panels about it. The next big step in the descendant relationship was the weekend of Juneteenth in 2019. Descendants organized a gathering, came together at Montpelier, and it was that weekend, that is the Friday night before the Saturday of Juneteenth, that the descendants decided to organize themselves into their own independent 501c3 organization called the Montpelier Descendants Community to represent descendants. So they sort of chose their own representative board, if you will, and that became the formal entity that Montpelier staff, and by this point Montpelier leadership, would work with and work through. So no longer were we deciding who we were going to ask to do what. We went through the Montpelier Descendant Committee, and so the descendants were in control of how the partnership moved forward. Next slide, please. In November of 2019, the Montpelier Descendants Committee held a workshop to start thinking about memorializing the cemetery of the enslaved. And that's a project that's very much alive and well today. Next slide, please. And of course, that was the end of 2019. That was when our previous president, Kat Imhoff, and the board chair with her both left the organization totally of their own choosing, for no reasons that are in any way nefarious. And there was a search, and there was a new president and a new board chair joined Montpelier. The board chair joined right as COVID was getting ready to, shut us down, and the president joined in, I think, March or April, after COVID had shut us down. So it's this really, we all remember that moment. We were last open on Friday, March 13th, 2020. So with the new leadership in place, in 2020, the Montpelier Descendants Committee, approached the new leadership to start talking together to find out about, talk about working together. And I do not have any answer for how this happens, but the new leadership was unaware of the rubric that had been created, of the rubrics, the rubric, as I should have said earlier, the rubric emphasizes the critical importance of structural parity between organizations and descendants in governance and decision making. And so the new leadership and the Descendants Committee did not get off on the best foot. So that led to, sort of a year of conversations. And the next June 2021, the Montpelier Foundation Board voted to work towards structural parity with the Montpelier Descendants Committee. And these are some of the headlines from various articles and press releases. So what that would look like in practice was that the Montpelier Descendants Committee, the independent 501c3 that represented the Descendants community, would nominate at least half of the members of the Montpelier Foundation Board, so that they would then again have representation on the board. The people that they nominated to be on the board did not have to be descendants, did not have to live anywhere near Orange, Virginia, did not even have to be African American. But it would be people nominated by the Montpelier Descendants Committee to represent them on the Montpelier board. So that was the work from June 18th, 2021, moving forward, was to figure out how to create and establish that relationship. Next slide, please. Next, please. Okay, so everything was proceeding along. I mean, it was very difficult, very tense. As a staff member, my colleagues and I really didn't know what was going on. But in March of 2022, so just a little less than a year ago, which is kind of wild to think about, the Montpelier Foundation Board voted to not, in fact, create a relationship of parity with the independent 501c3 that represented the descendants, but to create one with the descendants that they would choose. So obviously that was not a move that was in keeping with the rubric, or that was sort of along the lines that they had been moving. It was really just kind of a big step backwards. So a number of staff members, next slide, a number of my colleagues and I spoke to the Washington Post about the experience that we had over the years with this work and sort of leading up to the time of the reversal. And after that, 3 of us were fired, and 2 were put on a leave with pay. And what that succeeded in doing was basically shutting down our archaeology department, which, as I said before, was very well known in the field of archaeology and way beyond, for its public-facing archaeology, for its work with the descendants, for its research on the institution of slavery and how slavery worked here at Montpelier. So, and I'm sure you all followed in museum world, media and everything, the whole drama. The next slide, please. And then finally, because of all the pressure this is the big feature that Deneen Brown did in the Washington Post. Next, please. There was a petition on change.org. The remaining staff, the full-time staff, made a statement. They posted Next, please. And then as I'm sure you all remember, lots of media about it. On May the 16th, the Montpelier Foundation Board agreed to in fact create the parity relationship, and they elected 11 members of the board nominated by the Montpelier Descendants Community. And so that is how structural parity was finally achieved last May. And the new board chair, James French, at that point asked me if I would return to Montpelier as the interim president and CEO. And I did that for 8 months, but I should make clear that I have now stepped back from that role and gone back to my job as the head of the museum programs division here in Montpelier. So that's the story of sort of how it all went down. And I would be very interested and pleased to take questions from anybody, or from Sean, who's gonna push them to me.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. This is absolutely fascinating, and to get that firsthand perspective on something that was really the story in history museum field just so recently, less than a year ago. So thank you again. And again, if anybody does have questions, please use the Q&A function and we'll get to as many of them as we can. But to start off with, has Montpelier, has anybody else with the organization worked with other similar sites that are at an earlier stage in the process that are just beginning to establish those collaborative relationships and those partnerships with the descendant communities?
That is such an important question. Thank you for that. That was one of the things that we hoped would happen after the rubric, was published and made available to whoever wanted to see it and use it. So yes, we have been talking even before everything started in 2020. We had been talking to other sites for years, but just because the work we were doing at the staff level was known. And so, yes, a lot of organizations have come to ask us for advice, input. They've involved members of the Descendant Committee, obviously. So yes, I do feel like the work here and the drama here have had some positive impact on the field. At least I hope.
Well, I certainly think so. It's been, a range of emotions as everything played out from all of us who do work with history museums, and especially thank you for sharing the information about the rubric. I see that Stephanie put that in the chat, so anybody can access that. I know I plan to use that starting at a meeting I have tonight. So thank you for putting that together. Do you have that all of this just, it's obvious that the events that took place played out against the backdrop of an increasingly polarized political division within the United States. And what has it been like for you and your colleagues to be in the spotlight of this? This is one of the biggest fault lines in American politics, and what's that been like?
Well, even before any of this started, just because of the exhibition we had and the work that we were known for, we would have lots of pushback from our visitors. But we also had people who really very much valued and learned from the experiences we had here. So we were no strangers to people telling us what we were doing was, ruining James Madison and, tearing down American history. But direct pushback. So in the summer, so after parity had been achieved and my colleagues and I had come back, there were publications there were sort of right-leaning publications that published, in one case, quite provocatively, like threatening stories that were then picked up by people who read them. So we definitely had very scary phone messages and emails, which I'll just say, caused us to increase security last summer. But we stayed the course. We're still getting from time to time articles about us. The Heritage Foundation did a seminar either in the summer or early fall called "The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly" about Mount Vernon, Monticello, and us. You can imagine who was who. We continue to get pushback from visitors. So yes, this is a, as we all know, as museum professionals, it's a really fraught time. And what I always say to people is, I am not taking anything away from James Madison. Everything important, remarkable, outstanding, brilliant that James Madison did remains. I'm simply making the story complete by talking about slavery and enslavement and him as an enslaver. What we do here is tell whole truth history. We're saying now we tell our shared American origin story so that everyone can see themselves in it. And that's what we do. So
yeah, thank you. I think that's an incredible perspective. I know I've used that in my own work and say that you're not taking anything away, and it can lead to cognitive dissonance from some people to think it is either or, and it's not. It is both. And yeah, that is sometimes a useful tool. It doesn't dispel every objection, but it says this is an additive process, not a replacement process. We've got a great question here from Carlos, who asks, why did it take so long for the board to get behind the efforts to collaborate with the descendants and then later change their minds?
So going way back before 2019, I see it now as a mistake that the collaboration stayed at the staff level and then eventually got up to the level of the executive leadership. I advise anybody doing this work today at any stage, make sure that your board, your executive leadership is involved, because you can have the kind of problems that we had if you don't do that. It's critically important for all levels of the organization to be engaged, and that's a major point in the rubric. So I cannot answer that question. I personally, and I look back at the agendas and PowerPoints that I had presented, I spoke to our board numerous times about the rubric itself. That there were still a lot of people. We did not do a good job sharing the information. That's what I will say.
It's never easy, is it? Yeah, but thank you for that answer. Another terrific question from Angela. I imagine that the struggle to gain parity and the begrudging stance of the Montpelier board has undercut a lot of the trust that have been built over time. How are relations going to be rebuilt, and how is collaboration proceeding since May of 2022?
Right. So the new board members that were elected in May, nominated by the Montpelier Descendants Committee, are all superstars in the fields of academia, history, public policy, journalism. They are incredible, and so now that the board is so incredibly important and prominent, things are really rolling forward in a wonderful way. That we really have a much more national board than we ever had before. And it's, things are moving ahead in an incredibly good, positive direction. So yeah, it was that vote on May 16th changed everything.
Okay, thank you. A question about some technology from Kenneth, which is, what are your thoughts on whether and how historic sites such as Montpelier might integrate technologies such as 3D displays and augmented reality to increase audience engagement with the past? Is that something that archaeological sites are looking to implement in the future, beyond the ones that you had mentioned earlier in your presentation?
That's a great question. So moving forward, we have 4 big projects that we're working on. And one of them we're calling Reimagining the Visitor Experience. And we're putting everything on the table, everything. And I feel quite sure that we will have very robust conversations about augmented reality and all other technologies that museums are engaging with. Our archaeology team is incredibly, they're leaders in GIS and story maps and things that I don't even know how to say. So I think that our site rooted technology abilities are going to be pretty amazing, both for people that are here and people that are not here. So I'm very excited about that moving forward. Another big project that we're working on is we are moving forward on creating a memorial at the Montpelier burial ground, which is where those enslaved here lie. And so that's actively moving forward in partnership with the Montpelier Descendants Community.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. So we had a question going back to the level of the objects themselves, that as you've moved through this entire process, how has it affected the way that you think about Montpelier's collections? And have any of the objects in the collection helped guide your thinking?
That's a really great question. So before I was here at Montpelier, and I've been here for 7.5 years, I worked previously at Monticello, and Monticello was really fortunate to do an exhibition in 2012, opened in 2012, with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, when they didn't even have a hole in the ground. They were just doing exhibitions at the American History Museum, and they were in offices. And I'm sure it's been done elsewhere prior to that, but one of the things that we did was exhibit archaeologically recovered pieces of objects that had belonged to enslaved people. And I really wondered if the general public who comes to the Smithsonian would find a little piece of ceramic, a button, a bone toothbrush, would they find that important? Would it be resonant? And actually, we found that people that it was, and we've certainly found that doing archaeology here at Montpelier. So in the exhibition that I talked about, the only real objects in it are archaeologically recovered, because those are the things that belong to enslaved people. And I'm sure you all in collections know in general that possessions of those who were enslaved, there are not that many. I mean, the fraction of things that survived whole versus the things that survived in pieces, is very unbalanced. So we definitely exhibit archaeologically recovered items. One of my concerns when we first opened the exhibition in 2017 is that the upstairs experience in the Madison house would still be the kind of typical, pretty elite house tour. And in the lower spaces, the cellar spaces where the enslaved worked and sometimes lived, and where the exhibition was, that would just come across as we're putting it in the basement. We don't care about it. No one gives a tour down there. It's self-guided. So we really were conscious and intentional about having that not happen, although I'm sure it did. I've heard that it did, people came away with that. During COVID, one thing we did that was actually, I think, quite helpful was we minimized the amount of time spent in the house. So the tour was outside in the landscape. It was about 2/3 outside and 1/3 inside. So nobody could leave, not realizing that they were at a plantation. And we kind of minimized the house, but of course we got a lot of pushback about that. So now we're trying to create a balance where people feel like they've seen the house, because unfortunately, no matter how hard we work at it, the people that come here still believe that they're coming to see a house, even though after they're coming to see a plantation. So we're still working at getting the balance right, where people will not complain, but we're kind of doing justice to the entire story. And that was like no way to answer that question. I'm sorry. So yes, so in the house, we are now that the tour is going to be more house focused. We are thinking in every single space, what can objects in this space, what objects can we put in this space that will make it clear that the stories of the Madison family and their guest and the enslaved are completely intertwined and cannot be pulled apart from each other. I hope that long ramble answered your question.
No, it is a good answer, and I think that it shines a light on the fact that this work is not quick, it is not easy, it is perhaps not for the faint of heart, but it is absolutely essential if we want to tell, as you said, a full and accurate, truthful history and involve everyone. This work is it's as essential as it may seem daunting. And we've got this may be the last question we have time for, but have you done any evaluation work on the site and spoken to the visitors and understood their expectations either before they have arrived at the site, before they started the tour, or once they have completed their experience at Montpelier? And if you could share any of those insights with us, that would be terrific.
Yeah, that is such an important question, and I wish I had a better answer. So, like many organizations, we have been very, I'll say, not up to snuff in doing either preliminary, formative, or after the fact evaluations. We did do it for one project, but it wasn't related to the tours that we give. So we sorely need to do some evaluations. What we do have is sort of a sheet people can fill out about their visit, and we also send online surveys to everybody that buys a ticket online. But those are, of course, filled out by the people that had a wonderful time and the people that hated it. So not a scientific survey. So one of my goals here is to do formative and summative evaluations to understand how we're doing, basically from the point of view of the visitor.
Yes, and I completely agree with you. There is no such thing as a 3-star review. It's either 5 stars or it's 1 star. I think that anybody who's ever done any work in this thinks, like, doesn't everybody have a it was okay kind of experience? And judging by surveys filled out, nobody. So I think it is right at the top of the hour. So again, I want to say thank you, Elizabeth, for coming here and speaking with us today. This has been tremendously helpful. As we heard at the start of the presentation, this recording will be made available in its entirety on the Curated Conversations channel on YouTube. The best practices were put into the chat a little earlier, or you can just Google the Montpelier Descendants. I would also like to say that there is a one day, there's still spaces available with a virtual conference for the Northern Slavery Collective. It takes place Monday. It's an all-day event in Yonkers, New York, and it will be, it's about interpretation of enslavement in a Northern perspective. It's the first conference. So for anybody who is interested in that, then if you look up Northern Slavery Collective, I think it's only $15 fee for the virtual conference for anybody who wants to continue to have this. So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you to event support. Thank you, Dr. Chu. And we look forward to hearing from more great speakers in the future. And we certainly hope to see as many of you as possible at future events in our curated conversation series.
Thank you. It was an honor to be here.